titled Tunisia's 2024 Presidential Elections, What's at Stake? My name is Laila Dos, and I'm Time-App's Media and External Relations Manager. I'll be today's monitor, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all. So Tunisians will vote in presidential elections on October 6th, and in the months leading up to the vote, authorities have arrested or prosecuted several candidates who were planning to or would have run for office. And the Independent Higher Election Authority has barred 14 from running on procedural grounds. However, some court challenges have progressed successfully. Ultimately, a limited number of candidates are now permitted to challenge sitting President Kais Saied, while the political environment in which the vote takes place remains an increasingly repressive one. Said's administration has stifled the judiciary's independence, cracked down on peaceful dissent, and over 60 journalists, lawyers, and political opponents have been prosecuted under Decree Law 54. Meanwhile, Tunisia's economy is facing severe challenges. The unemployment rate is at 15%, and roughly 1 in 3 Tunisians live in poverty, as inflation has eaten away at much of the population's standard of living. And President Said has weaponized an anti-migrant discourse to deflect blame from worsening socioeconomic conditions, all while at the same time negotiating with European partners for migration deals to keep migrants off of European shores. Here with us to discuss Tunisia's presidential elections, the political, economic, and social context surrounding them, and what's next is an esteemed panel. But before we kick off the conversation, I'd like to briefly introduce each of our speakers. First of all, we're joined by Lamine Bengazi, head of the Rule of Law and Justice Program at Avocats Sans Frontières and former non-resident fellow at Time-App. We also have Hamza Muddeb, research fellow and director of the Political Economy Program at Carnegie Middle East Center, and Huda Mzaudit, a freelance researcher on Tunisian and Libyan affairs. A note for our audience, I'm going to start the conversation with 2 rounds of moderated questions, after which we'll open up the floor to the audience with a Q&A. Please submit your questions using the Q&A feature on Zoom, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And feel free to submit them throughout the discussion, and we'll get to them at the designated time. Just a quick reminder that this is also being recorded. So let's get started. So first of all, this is a question for Lamine. Tunisians will vote in presidential elections on October 6th, and in the months leading up to the vote, we've seen a variety of tactics to disqualify or target the vast majority of challengers to Kais Saied amid a larger wave of political repression. So can you first tell us about the electoral space, who's running, and what have been some of the tactics leveraged against candidates? And also, what role have the courts played in this process?
Thank you very much, Leila, and thank you, Time-App, for this very timely event. I'm very happy to share this panel with Hamza and Huda. And thank you, Leila, as well, for facilitating my work by presenting a precise context of the situation, because, of course, we cannot isolate these elections from the social, economic, and political context in which they are occurring. But so I will maybe start my first intervention with the electoral calendar. We'll isolate that for the sake of me not speaking for 3 hours about all the violations that we have been witnessing against the rule of law and against freedom over the past 3 years. So this political race journey has been filled with obstacles and landmines since even before the electoral calendar was put in place, which has resulted in us having 3 candidates, including the incumbent, including one in prison, who is not the incumbent, who is a third candidate, actually the number 1. And we witnessed irregularities in terms of due process, in terms of electoral procedures since the very beginning of this electoral calendar, which has which took a lot of time before its actual publishing. The date of the elections was only announced on the 4th of July, and the electoral calendar was only available to other candidates on the 4th of July. Why is this important? It's because it left very little time for candidates to prepare themselves, and namely to collect a very complex number of signatures of sponsorships, either from 40 presidents of local authorities, 10 MPs. That's impossible under this current context. It's almost impossible because virtually almost all individuals who presented themselves in the elections set up by President Kais Saied are people who are supportive of the regime. What's left is the collection of 10,000 signatures in at least 10 constituencies with at least 500 voters. So that's a very complex task, especially in a context of fear and repression. Just to give you a point of comparison, in 2019, where the EZ was fully independent in the choosing of the electoral date, it has always been a point of contention between the EZ and the political parties. But the EZ always has stood its ground, at least for that part, and in choosing the electoral date. In 2019, the electoral calendar was announced in March for elections taking place in November. So that's to give you a point of comparison. Then we have witnessed an introduction of new administrative measures that might seem innocent, but that are not, namely the bulletin number 3, which is a criminal record document, which might seem a normal document. You want your future president of the republic to have a clean slate, but in Tunisia, it's almost impossible to obtain when serving a prison sentence or when having legal pursuit. And in fact, we have warned about this as civil society. And in fact, it has translated in many complications for electoral candidates to obtain this type of document. And that served later on as a basis from the EZ, among other reasons, to dismiss candidates. Public financing has been suppressed. Why is this a problem? It's a problem when you have an incumbent who is in power and who, according to many accounts, is using state funds and means in the context of an electoral race. For example, field visits have been multiplied over the past few months. Declaration in terms of the state being enrolled in social policies have also increased. Attacks against candidates on the presidential Facebook page. So are these considered public financing? And is there somebody controlling them? It's a rhetorical question, of course. Well, not to mention also the judicial harassment that many candidates have faced, either whether they were serving prison sentences, such as Abir Musi, or Lotfi al-Mraihi, who eventually was imprisoned for a declaration where he actually just was assessing the mandate of the President of the Republic. There's also types of judicial and administrative harassment, such as travel bans from appearing in public, affairs dating from many years ago that have suddenly resurfaced in the context of these elections. So this climate forced these tactics eliminated the number of candidates either directly, whereas others have also dropped out of the race, such as Admiral Akrut or the very shady Kadri. So all of this was expected to happen, of course. But in September, and here's where things started to get interesting, the unexpected happened. Unexpected, not to me, it was unexpected for me, but it was also unexpected from the lawyers representing those candidates. The administrative court, at the beginning of this month, reinstates 3 candidates, essentially based on, motivated by the fact that the bulletin number 3 is not a necessary document and it's unconstitutional, that the EZ was too harsh in assessing the sponsorship. It had criteria who were too difficult for candidates, and therefore reinstated three candidates. Why I say unexpected, because the decision of the administrative court restored some faith in the judiciary, including within the judiciary. It restored dignity for judges and the notion that the rules of the game might not be that unfair after all. And by de facto, it also restored some faith in the electoral process, and people started suddenly discussing about their favorite candidate, who they might vote for, discussing the programs. So it wired up political life for a very short period of time. Unfortunately, it was very short-lived, a weekend to be precise. And on a Monday morning, the EZ, the electoral body, advances its press conferences and declares that it refuses to enforce the decision of the administrative court, which has exclusive jurisdiction over electoral dispute. This is unprecedented, but highly in sync with the current climate of the law of the fittest. After all, this is what we are witnessing. I will spare you the legal brawling between the electoral authority and the administrative court, but essentially the electoral body initially said, well, we received the court decision after the 48 hours legal deadline. And
sorry to interrupt. We're going to have to cut short. Let's finish your last sentence and we can move on to the next question.
Sure. Yeah. I just conclude by saying that these elections, they only mirror the social, institutional, and political climate that we are living, and the systematic suppression of the rule of law, independence of the judiciary, etc. But one thing that I want to mention before closing my first intervention is that this is not a legal battle. This is a political battle that has transformed into a moral crisis of a regime and its supporter who don't see these elections as a normal election of discussion between candidates on programs, etc., but as a struggle for survival, as an existential battle. And in an existential battle, by all means necessary means by all means necessary.
Thank you so much, Lamin. That was extremely thorough and a great overview of everything. So we're going to move on to Hamza, where we'll talk more about the economy. Tunisia is grappling with high unemployment rates, among the highest in the region, rising inflation, and growing discontent, as seen in the most recent September 13th protests, which were some of the biggest that Tunisia has seen in a very long time. And this is obviously a key area of importance in the electoral discussion. So can you give us a quick snapshot into the current economic situation and the key economic proposals of Said as president and candidate, and as well as his challengers as well?
Yeah, thank you, Leila, and thanks for time up for the invitation. And I'm happy really to join Huda and Lamin for this discussion. Actually, well, I mean the economy is quite an important topic. For Tunisia, especially given the terrible economic situation of the country. The paradox is that the economy isn't part of the discussion actually during this election campaign, and this is not surprising, really. I think Lamin explained very well to what extent this chaotic and repressive electoral process is impacting the evolution of things in Tunisia on a day-to-day basis. These legal battles, political battles, etc., are quite attracting actually the focus of most of the political actors. But another factor is quite important to notice. To explain the absence of the economy in the debate today in Tunisia is the poor performance, or the poor performance of Said in handling the economy and in addressing or tackling even the economic emergencies in the country. Actually, it's not really surprising. Said knows. He's the first one to know that he failed really miserably to fix the economic challenges Tunisia has been facing, at least, I mean, since his power grab in 2021. And numbers are here really to attest and to show to what extent really, I mean, the situation that was, I'm not saying it was a good situation before 2021. It was really already a difficult situation, but to what extent the situation has deteriorated actually since 2021, and especially over the previous year or two. Just to give you a sense of the, as you asked, I mean, about a snapshot of the economy. I mean, in 2023, Tunisia saw its lowest growth rate for a decade, or in a decade, actually. Tunisia has never really made such a poor performance, which is 0.4% of growth rate, at the exception, of course, of 2020, which is when the pandemic hit. And of course, all the economic indicators went down. Basically, with the deterioration of the living standards, with the decline of investment, I mean, of the decline of consumption, basically, either of households or of companies. As you mentioned in your introduction, actually, the number of Tunisians, the poor Tunisians, has increased. If we take only the Tunisians who are entitled to receive social assistance, according to the Ministry of Social Affairs, there are 1 million households who are considered as poor. So we are speaking about 3 to 4 million poor Tunisians, actually, which is really, it gives you an idea about the disaster. The investment rate hit rock bottom, actually, with the lowest rate since independence, since '56. The business climate has been deteriorating, with a private sector suffering, with business people either in jail or fleeing the country, and actually, within or in the middle of this gloomy, really economic assessment, we had Said repeating that the country, I mean, needs to preserve sovereignty, and using this narrative about counting on ourselves, etc. But the reality is that Tunisia has been relying a lot on debt, and this is really something extremely important to notice. The acceleration of debt since even before, of course, 2021, but after 2021, actually. And we saw public debt reaching 80% of the GDP, if we count or we take into consideration the debt guaranteed by the state, which reflects at least partially the poor situation of the state-owned companies. We will end up with public debt, total public debt, exceeding 100% of the GDP. And this gives you an idea about to what extent, I mean, the economic situation is, the Tunisia's economy is in a disastrous situation, and why economy has been sidelined from the public debate and from the discussion on for these elections. Now, I must maybe say few words, about how Said managed actually to navigate over the past 3 years, how to navigate this really extremely difficult and disastrous economic situation. Because this is quite interesting, actually, to see how populism is concretely implemented in Tunisia. And this gives you a sense about the ruling tactics and the governing mechanisms implemented by Said. And I do think that actually Said and his regime implemented relied on three main strategies, basically. The first one is to keep a high level of social spending, keeping the subsidies, etc. Now, it doesn't mean that everything is okay, that especially poor Tunisians have benefited from this, because simply the flip side of the coin is that the regime orchestrated shortages, tried to limit really the imports and of course to limit the use of foreign currencies. So we Tunisians have been living for more than 2 years now under shortages, on a day-to-day basis, shortages of wheat, of cooking oil, of many food products, etc. So this is one aspect. But now what is really interesting to notice is that the imports, the limitation of imports have hit also the industrial inputs, actually. And this really impacted heavily the private sector and the growth and the private sector performance and the growth performance, actually. But yeah, more or less, this kept the situation afloat. That's basically the end result of this tactic. The second maybe strategy used by Said is really to rely heavily on domestic debt and on the central bank financing, actually. And here we must say one thing extremely important that many Tunisia watchers and observers don't insist on it. There is no independent central bank today in Tunisia. And really, I mean, this is something extremely important to insist on. The law that was voted in February 2024, allowing the central bank to fund directly the budget deficit with 7 billion of Tunisian dinars, almost, I mean, the equivalent more than $2 billion, actually, is quite important to notice. And over at least 3 to 4 years now, the regime has heavily relied on domestic debt, actually, on financing using the commercial banks to fund the budget deficit. Of course, this has created inflation, and today the inflation is officially at 7%. So if you take the food products and basic products, we are at an inflation of 2 digits, actually. So this is also another tactic to gain time, actually, to keep the situation afloat, but to prevent default, of course. But the end result of this tactic is the killing of the growth, actually, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. With 0.4% is quite really, I mean, this is not a growth that will allow Tunisia to address its structural economic problems. And they will end up with the last point, actually, to explain how Said navigated this shaky and completely chaotic, actually, economic situation that he contributed to create and to exacerbate, by the way, is through building a patronage networks. And I do think that his communal companies, what we call in Tunisia, the Sharikat al-Ahliya, which is a sort of, cooperatives under the control of regional governors and funded by the state budget. I mean, this is really, I mean, everyone knows in Tunisia that the contribution of these companies to the economy is nothing, actually. And the result is typically really creating a sort of patronage network that will be useful during the elections. Now, I do think that this is really quite marginal strategy that is relatively inefficient, because if we take into consideration the low turnout of the previous elections, either the parliamentary or the referendum, etc., I mean, people they didn't go to the polls to vote for Said, and Tunisia actually witnessed really extremely ridiculous turnouts. We will see for this how things will turn for this or will go for these presidential elections. But my sense is that people are those who support Said. They do have a sort of passive support for Said, but most of the people really they are in a situation where really they are trying really to keep a certain distance, or most of the population is quite absent. And I think the turnouts are here to show that the population is getting increasingly disinterested by all this messy and chaotic political and electoral process, actually. So this is quite interesting, actually. Here, Said is innovating with a sort of populism without the people. I mean, there is a populist figure, a populist leader, a populist president, but claiming, of course, to act in favor of the population, but the population is absent. And I think the 6th of October will be an important here, I mean, a big moment, political moment to understand to what extent really the disaffection of Tunisian people can express itself in the polls and in the participation rate.
Thank you, Hamza, for that. That was really interesting. Huda, so we have a question for you next. In the lead up to elections, we've seen Said step up his rhetoric, vilifying migrants in Tunisia in an attempt to deflect attention from the country's economic woes. Can you tell us more about Said's rhetoric and policy on migrants so far, and how do other candidates approach the issue of migration, if they do so at all?
Thank you, Leila, for moderating this panel, and thank you, Taimab, also for organizing this event as well. Well, I think although Said's rhetoric, racist rhetoric, was tempered since his speech last year because of the backlash from outside, it continued, unfortunately, to reverberate over a year after exposing Said's repressive dealings with the Black African migrants, be they residents or transiting through the country. And it's guided by racism, xenophobia, and conspiratorialism. And he injects his racism in his populist appeal. In the case of Said's, conspiratorialism, it is he tries to translate the European far right's Great Replacement theory in its Tunisian version, and has he publicly proclaimed in more than one occasion that there is an Afrocentric plot organized by criminal enterprises that was modeled on the Zionist project of the late 19th century. It was put in motion in the early 2000s with the goal of changing the demographic read Arab makeup of Tunisia. And that tale actually was spun by the Tunisian Nationalist Party, which has always supported Said since his go in 2021, particularly, and it has been calling actually for the expulsion of Black African migrants from Tunisia, especially in the cities of Tunis and Sfax since 2018, and they connected with him, trying to show to depict, a catastrophic image of Tunisia being driven by these Black African hordes. Also, in his speech, especially even as I said, it has toned down a little bit of his rhetoric against, Black African migrants and more focusing on irregular migration as a threat. We see that he uses double speak, of a denial and overt racist rhetoric, so that everything is not seen as openly racist. And so, by combining this overt speech making and denialism, he tries to facilitate, the normalization of anti-Black racism in Tunisia, and that's even despite that he defended himself against accusation of him being anti-Black racist. But he also resorts to public warnings of a plot to colonize Tunisia, and that has legitimated some vigilante groups, throughout the country to go and attack Black African migrants, especially the ones who are in Tunisia because they're not planning to stay in the country indefinitely. So most of them, they're trying to reach the European shores, and yet they're the ones who have been suffered the most from this racist backlash since 2023 at least. So his promotion of this racist populist discourse, has given way to a state-sanctioned anti-Black violence, and there's a consequence actually to his racist populism by defining the problem of migration in his way that and modeled it, to the European model, especially to the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, with whom he has a lot of affinities, and both of them they have zero tolerance for what they see as illegal immigration. They are also believe that there need to be vigilance from ethnic outsiders who manage to make a home inside their country. So usually in other terms, the fear of the fifth column, trying to stir dissent within the country. And that exacerbates the public anxieties for a society that is very vulnerable, especially politically, economically. And it's very expedient for Qais Said, politically speaking. His speech is very performative as well. His discourse is quite performative, where his speech flirts with racism. And he might perform, solidarity with the African continent and proclaiming that Africa belongs to Africans. I mean, very similar to what Gaddafi used to do in the past. He did that, last year during the 6th European Union, African Union Summit. But when it comes to Tunisia, it's clearly doesn't mean brotherhood with Africans. The fact that in last summer, 2023, there 1,200 Black Africans were thrown in the Sahara Desert along the border with Libya, where more than 24 of them died of thirst and hunger, made this unambiguous that, there's this brotherhood is just, mere rhetoric. And so his attempts, at trying to appropriate the Tunisia's anti-discrimination law with the horrifying speech of February 2023. And so in a way, Said traffics in a racism-infused form of populism to buttress his rule. And just to show his partners, in the North, in Europe in particular, that that he's dealing with the issue of migration in a manner that would please them. His rhetoric carries an accusation of treason of civil society and NGOs, calling them mercenaries and traitors who are trying to inflict harm on the state in the name of freedom of expression. And again, using the speech about a plot designed to implant sub-Saharan Africans in the country, and he would accuse specific individuals who received money in 2018 in order to bring irregular migrants into Tunisia. And so in his diatribe against civil society organizations and activists, he tries to. He's accusing them of trying to weaken the state, okay? And the president, his argument is relies on some sort of reports that he gets from his advisors, or about some associations that had received money, or that they had signed tenders, to host some migrants. And by also magnifying the numbers of, the money, the millions of dinars, in funding from overseas. That's his favorite, usually sentence that he uses, to accuse and criminalize these civil society or organizations and activists. And we've seen, the impact of such a rhetoric, that especially in areas where Black African migrants have been have sought refuge, especially in Amr and Jibinian and Sfax. A lot of them they found refuge in near olive groves, and there was a public outrage, from the population, that the influx of these sub-Saharan migrants in the country was almost a plot, from outside foreign actors that then they have never been named by Said, but people, they know sometimes they point out to Algeria, pushing these migrants into Tunisia. But basically, we know that the main culprit in that, is European Union through its externalization of its border to the North African country. And to come back to his supporters, in his use of this racist anti-migrant rhetoric, whether from political, small political parties like the Tunisian Nationalist Party, which is, even though it hasn't a lot of public support, but it's very active on social media. So using hate speech on social media has exacerbated also this the feeling of anger towards civil society organizations from Tunisians. Talking about average Tunisians who accuse these people of destabilizing Tunisia, and we have seen, unfortunately, the results. Since May, of the imprisonment of civil society activists such as Adia Mosbeha from Magnemti, or Sharif Al-Riyahi from Tunisia D'Azil. all of these, and this is when activism has become very dangerous in Tunisia. When you see people whose only crime is just coming to the rescue of vulnerable migrants. It shows, how his use of this rhetoric, is making him very popular, I have to say, within his space. Even though, as earlier discussed by Hamza and Lamin, that the people, are becoming, there's a fatigue, from the population, that their voices are repressed, and so he finds, the only way to make himself legitimate is through the use of rhetoric, because it sells more to his partners in the north, and so he has been using more and more sticks and no more carrots for civil society organizations, because for him, his war of liberation, as he loves to call it, is against irregular migration, and it continues. Thus, the increasing number of civil society figures who have been arrested, as well as accusations, against them for of plotting, to colonize Tunisia with these Black African migrants. Their accusations sometimes, amount to serious accusations such as money laundering, being involved with criminal association, who aim to assist people in trying to gain access to Tunisian territory. And so, according to him, for other candidates, they haven't had a specific or open statement against this regarding irregular migration or Black African migrants. But for example, for Zohair Maghzawi, his number 2 candidate for these elections, he often, as part of his political political culture, being from Arab nationalists. So he usually links this to the global Western-led world order inequalities and colonialism. And so he's more of a diplomatic in the way that he does not openly accuse of Black African migrants of trying to destabilize the country, but he links the irregular migration to the conflict between the North and the South, and the result of French colonization of Africa and the looting of its wealth. So, and even Said sometimes uses that, but because for his political survival, and sometimes this anti-racist rhetoric serves well his agenda.
Thank you for that, Huda. So, Hamza, I have a question for you. Over the last year, there's been a number of developments invoking the question of whether Tunisia would get and accept an IMF agreement. And so what do you expect the international financial institutions like the IMF and foreign governments, we spoke a bit about, some of you spoke a bit about Italy and also the other countries that are involved as well, to have as the country continues to experience severe economic challenges beyond this election? So what key developments should we be watching for in the near future?
Yeah, thanks, Leila. Actually, I do think that the international community will find itself in a tricky position, actually, after the elections of the 6th of October, simply because they will have to deal with I think the European Union or the international financial institutions, starting with the IMF, they will have to deal with a weak president. Because the end result of this chaotic and contested process that was described by Lamin earlier, and especially after the ruling of the administrative court, is really the result will be a highly contested election, and the weakening really that will end up if Said got re-elected, even and hold on to power after the 6th of October. He will end up being a hyper president, but extremely contested and extremely weak. My sense is that, and this will be challenging for the international community, of course, because a weak and illegitimate and contested president is really different. And the paradox here is that Said after the 6th of October will be weaker than Said before the 6th of October. But before the 6th of October, he was strong with the legitimacy of the elections of 2019 under democratic setting. Now, with all this rigged, abused, repressive, flawed process, he cannot claim to be as legitimate as he was actually before the 6th of October. Now, I think knowing the pragmatism on international relations, my sense is that the European countries will recognize these elections because simply most of them, they are interested now to preserve the migration deal or the migration agreement. And Said showed, and his regime, they showed over the previous months that they have the capacity to curb actually the flows of migrants. The Italians, they have been repeating that and insisting that their strategy actually to strike this deal with Said has been successful. And if we compare between 2024 and 23, there are 6% decrease in the number of arrivals to Italy from the Tunisian coasts. This is important to take into consideration. And my sense is that Europeans, they will give the priority to really keep this deal and to preserve this deal. Actually, here I cannot really mention one thing that is extremely important. My sense to understand this game between Said and the Italians / the European Union, that Said has been implementing this deal without receiving the 900 million euros, which is the big part, the big chunk of the financial compensation, which corresponds to the macro financial assistance mechanism. He couldn't receive this simply because this macro financial assistance mechanism is conditional to the IMF deal, and without an IMF, Tunisia cannot receive the big part of this financial compensation. But still, Said committed to implementing this deal. And my sense, the whole rationale behind this is political, to avoid actually being isolated internationally, knowing that his major priority is to be re-elected. And my sense, he will play this card actually in his relation with the European Union, that despite all the abuses, despite the repression, the prosecution of the opposition, the manipulation of the judiciary, the denial of the administrative court, he will try. He is the new president, and he is the re-elected. He got re-elected after the 6th of October. So this is for the European Union. My sense is that pragmatism will prevail. When it comes to the IMF, I think here the doors of the IMF are open, and I think all IMF officials, even when the relations, and they are still actually in their extreme low level with Tunisia, of course, they have been claiming that the doors of the IMF are open, but it's up to Tunisia and to Said to move actually and to go and to start to revive actually the relations with the IMF. And it seems to me this will be difficult, extremely difficult for two reasons. The first one is that Said has been, he has been saying no to the IMF, rejecting the IMF deal, etc. And by the way, he earned the new nickname in Tunisia, Mr. No. No to the IMF, no reforms, and no clear plan for the future. So it's really, we don't know what so unpredictable, we don't know what will be his plans for the future. This is one thing. The second thing is that the staff level agreement that was agreed on 2 years ago is dead today. So Tunisia and the regime has to come up with a new reform plan. And the third thing is that the review of the Article 4 has been postponed for more than 1 year and a half now, and this is really problematic. I'll end with one, I will conclude with one remark. My sense is that from the beginning, the gamble of Said has been betting on one thing, is to get really a bailout from somewhere, from Europeans or from the Gulfies or from the Saudis, or he wants to replicate the Egyptian model, actually, is to get really some geopolitical rent, to get a bailout using migration, using the threat that Tunisia might collapse, might end up falling in a failed state zone. And would the European accept this? Will they afford actually to let Tunisia down? this is really the big gamble of Said. And my sense, he has been so far relying on Algeria for financial and energy assistance, but Algeria is not the Emirates, Algeria is not Qatar, and Algeria has its own problems, actually, and his support is limited. The big gamble is really here, actually, in getting some financial bailout and getting financial support from somewhere, actually, in order to fund his populist project and to stay in power.
Great. Thank you, Hamza, for that. Relatedly, Huda, we have a question for you. The EU has been signing externalization agreements with countries of the MENA region to keep migrants off their shores. You've spoken a little bit about this, and you've spoken a little bit about Italy, one of these European countries, is also entering into migration-related deals with Tunisia. So with migration set to become an even more important issue around the elections and thereafter, can you tell us a bit more about the nature of the agreements, areas of concern you have about them, and how do we expect the policy conversation around migration in and on Tunisia to be in the months to come, even with the various candidates and their platforms as well?
Sure. I think, Said, has been using a little bit of Erdogan's strategy of political blackmailing to European leaders. After Tunisia has now displaced Libya as #1 departure for Black African migrants to Europe, he had received, European leaders, especially his favorite Giorgia Meloni, in almost, I think, 4 times in 2023. Something that has never happened, in the past, with other Tunisian leaders. But it shows you that when Meloni made her first official visit in June 2023, her trip was to discuss regular migration. And so the issue was on the agenda. That was the main issue, actually, between her to discuss between her and Said. And it remained a center for her government and for her party, Fratelli d'Italia. Before her visit, the arrivals in the island of Lampedusa, which is very close to Tunisia, had jumped considerably. And there was the great fears in Italy that Tunisia's economic crisis and the impasse it had reached in discussion with the IMF might soon prompt more and larger movements of irregular migrants. So when Meloni met with Said in Carthage Palace, at the time also with his Prime Minister, Najla Boudin, she met with her as well in the Qasba, the Prime Minister's office. They put on the agenda the European Union demands that they shall not let Tunisia fall economically, but also the fact that the European Commission president at the time, Ursula von der Leyen, and the Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte accompanied Meloni on another journey to Tunisia. They had this mission to negotiate enhanced cooperation on migration management. So this shows that they were trying to convince President Said, not to resist the notion of Tunisia becoming the border guards of Europe, which he ended up, doing that despite, his talk about, sovereignty of the country. Europe also saw in Said as an opportunity for its deal that it's possible to trade cooperation on migration for lifting the conditionalities that the IMF and the EU's official lenders have typically attached to financial assistance package. So during his meeting with Meloni last year, Said, he was clear. He said, warning the creditor demands for austerity threatened to ignite an explosive situation and strain Tunisia's social peace. That was something that, that probably Europeans didn't want to see, that Tunisia, Said, would always put these conditionalities that unless, that he's given, enough funds, then the number of migrants, would spike. So this blackmailing, kind of worked with Said, because he was trying to reach a deal with them, and he was hardly a deal breaker. So he was always animated by this immigration question first and foremost. But European leaders, they were not bothered by his interest, in by his rhetoric, because all what that matters for them is to stop them the migrants reaching the country. But ultimately, I mean, they kind of won, because now Tunisia has externalized its borders, and it has become. It has received a lot of money from the EU to have border police in islands, for example, of the islands of Qarqna, where right now the islands has become almost a no-go zone for a lot of Tunisians, because it's closer to Lampedusa. So, I mean, the question of sovereignty have become laughable, because right now the European borders are right there in these Tunisian islands, but also the fact that the EU, in some ways, they are bragging now that the number of migrants had been reduced to by 63%, and that was admired and seen as a model to be emulated by leftist politicians. Recently, Meloni has visited the UK, and Keir Starmer, congratulated Meloni on that, and so in her efforts, and by extension of Qais Said, a way to replicate that for the UK, and how to stem migration into the British Isles. So European politicians generally speak of the happy side's work. Even the newly appointed Minister of Interior of France, who ironically espoused the far-right rhetoric of regret replacement, he lauded Tunisia for its efforts, in curtailing the number of migrants. So again, to come back, to this racist populist, discourse, I think, that crusade of fighting irregular migration has found, resonance, with Qais Said and his European partners. For the elections, I think overall Western leaders, European leaders especially, will opt for business as usual, the status quo, and maintain Said at the helm of power, as they did during the war on terror with Ben Ali following 9/11. A famous book that was written by French journalist Nicolas Beau was called Ben Ali, Our Friend, was a French mantra at the time. Now there's a book actually that was written by that's going to be out for by Tunisian political essayist Hadem Nafti, called the Qais Said, Our Friend, and it's about the Tunisian what he coins the Tunisian dictatorship. A democratic dictatorship, and basically it's how Europeans are trying to replicate the same type of model that they had followed, with Ben Ali. As long as the regime is stable, as long as the incumbent, is applying, the rules of the game in halting, all these migrants. I mean, let's not really care about human rights abuse and all of that, because that's how the status quo could be kept. But for how long, that's the question that remains to be seen. And then I think after October 6th, we may not see the status quo becoming the remaining as it is, because I think economic and especially economic situation might push the population, to become, to resent, the lack of change, in their fortune, and the regime, might not probably survive for too long, as probably Western leaders are wishing for.
Thank you for that, Huda. So Lamine, we'll go back to you. In addition to the tightening space on the political level, civil society, lawyers and journalists have also been targeted, and increasingly so basically in the last year. And we've seen over 60 journalists, lawyers, and political opponents prosecuted under Decree Law 54, which is the country's cybercrime law. So how has civil society been organizing in the lead up to elections? What role do we expect them to play moving forward, whether on their own or in coalitions like the Tunisian Network of Freedoms and Rights? And where do you see that after a president is elected?
Well, Leila, the grip is definitely tightening on all those actors and on all those spaces. That's for sure. We discussed the candidates being eliminated one by one through judicial instrumentalization of the judiciary. Just as of today, yeah, we've candidate Ayeshi Zamel has been handed a new sentence. Former candidate Znaidi has been issued a search warrant for terrorism against him. We haven't discussed also the around 100 Nahda militants who were arrested in the 12th of September and who were and yeah, so all of that contributes to a huge political apathy. And in terms of journalism and freedom of the press, attacks on journalists continue. The EZ, for example, when we speak about elections, the EZ, for example, has removed credentials from journalists such as Paula Boukrim, who justified this decision on the grounds that Mrs. Boukrim's editorial line did not align with ethical standards set forth by the EZ. Journalists working in public media are suffering a great deal of harassment from their management, and this is resulting in a very poor, very imbalanced, very insipid media landscape in this electoral race. Public TV and radio, but also private ones, have turned into mouthpieces of the regime. There's almost no political discussions anymore. The remaining ones are very cautious about what they say. There has been recently two spots in national TV and in national radio glorifying the 25th of July process and demonizing the democratic transition in videos that are very reminiscent of what we have seen from public media prior to the revolution. Civil society, for its part, is on edge. As Houdet mentioned during the first wave of attacks against civil society, against the backdrop of, I don't want to call it the migration crisis, but let's call it that way. And now LGBT NGOs are victim of the same modus operandi, meaning Facebook pages generally supportive of the regime orchestrate campaigns against NGOs and individuals, and shortly after, summons and arrest start pouring. Actually, LGBT movement have been identified and been targeted in, I don't know if we can call it a program, but in the pamphlet of the President Qais Said, who, among many other things in his pamphlet, says that the Islamists are now in cahoots with people protecting LGBT rights. That's to tell you how hypocrites they are. Credentials for Muraqibun and iWatch have been removed also by the EZ, or were not handed to these NGOs. And as per lawyers, the Bar Association, I want to say, is trying, but has published a press release to denounce massive violations against their lawyers and pursuits launched against them. But one did not really call for proportionate actions against these violations, and had very mild position on the legal dispute between the administrative court and the Bar Association. There is the constitution of the Shabaka that you mentioned, and the Tunisian Network for Rights and Freedoms that gather political parties and CSOs. I think it's an important step. And it's an achievement in itself, in a sense that it breaks the silos between political parties and CSOs that have been prevalent since the 25th of July. And they have, more importantly, organized a series of very successful peace protests. And it's good because it breaks the barrier of fear. And there's another protest tomorrow at the occasion of a draft law, if we can call it a draft law, on the reform of the Electoral Code. We'll go back to it later. Maybe I saw some questions in the Q&A. But I think that what I want to say also is that even though we're witnessing an erosion of spaces of contest in the usual spaces of contest, where we see a weakening of, let's say, historical organizations in Tunisia. It's important to look for dissent elsewhere, and it exists elsewhere. New actors are entering the scene. There are such as artists. It might make some people smile, but there's the dancer and artist Nermin Sfar, who is actually having a huge impact on social media, and and we can also mention the new campaign that has resulted from the imprisonment of a young woman for posting a photo on Instagram with a middle finger in front of a poster of the incumbent. And a campaign was launched on social media. It's called the middle finger campaign, which is becoming viral. And so new actors are stepping in the game, and I think it's important because it breaks the idea that there's only the elite of the democratic transition who is clinging to its privileges and defending the remnants of the 2011 revolution. Some media outlets online are also replacing the void left by mainstream media, and one can only salute the work, for example, of the blogger Luay Cherny and the huge work that he's doing on streaming apps such as Kick. These are completely uncharted territories for us and for mainstream media. And finally, within state institutions as well, there is resistance. Let's start, for example, with the decision of the administrative court, but not only that. Within the judiciary, we see a frenetic level of sanctioning, of rotation of judges, of arbitrary decisions, of moving a judge from a place to another, refusal to grant promotion. We can see those as attacks on the judiciary, but there's another way to see it as well, which is there is a silent revolution within the judiciary that is happening. Are these the last gasps of the judiciary system, or truly a revolution that is taking in place in state institutions? That remains to be seen. Post-elections, it's very important to think about that. I think we were naive in thinking that many people were naive in thinking that this page would have been turned with free and fair elections, and that we would have seen a smooth transition to power, and we'd have moved to something else. It's not going to be like that, apparently. So it's going to require a lot of work. It's going to be complicated. It's going to be more dangerous, as Houday mentioned. There's a cost at activism, and I think that the cost of activism will be higher in the coming period, because, as Hamza mentioned, the power will get weaker, and when it will get weaker, it will automatically resort to more repression, in my opinion.
Thank you for that, Lamin. So we're reaching just about 25 minutes left, so we can start doing the Q&A. So actually, Lamin, I could actually start with you since you just spoke. Tomorrow, Tunisia's parliament will actually vote on a law that would strip the administrative court of its oversight over electoral disputes, just 2 weeks before the election, which, as we all know, will take place October 6th. If this law passes, what do you think the implications could be? And how likely is it that the administrative court will invalidate the election results? And then, what other legal avenues do you see around this looking forward? So if you could just briefly, obviously it's very hard to just say in like a few minutes.
Very briefly, they're all interlinked, so that's easy. So and to answer maybe a good question that I saw from Jacob, I think the 3 candidates that were ousted by the EZ but then reinstated by the administrative court, by virtue of that reinstation, are considered as candidates by the administrative court. Therefore, they have the right to contest the elections, which they have surely planned to do. And now the administrative court, regardless of the scenario of the draft law that is being discussed in the parliament, is in a position where it is it has the legal and moral duty, and for the sake of its credibility as well, to deem these elections illegal because of what happened with the electoral body. And this draft law that has been submitted by MPs last Friday, transmitted at the speed of light to the committee in the parliament, and examined at the same speed, where only the electoral EZ has been auditioned, and the government, who obviously said they were supportive of this draft law, and where the administrative court and the court of audit, who are the primary concern by this draft law, were not auditioned. Its main design is to strip the administrative court from that competence of litigating in electoral disputes. It is creating a split in the parliament. It's hard to say whether there's a majority in favor or against, because this parliament functions in full opacity. But we'll see tomorrow. And yes, if it passes, it will reduce or strip this electoral process of whatever's left of legitimacy.
Thank you for that, Lamine. Huda, I have a question for you. You've spoken a lot about migration, but what also could be very interesting to know is what challenges and opportunities do you foresee for Tunisian women, particularly in terms of their political and social rights following these elections? And have we seen any candidates even address gender? There's no women candidates, but what do you see, obviously in a few minutes, maybe, like in a very complicated way, I know, but let us know what you think about these.
I fear I'm going to be very pessimistic about that. Unfortunately, women are not present at all for the first time, I think, in Tunisian modern history, where their presence is absent. For some reason, of course, when you have a populist, misogynist, a racist president, it's obvious that that no one would venture, not even a political, figure would venture in and try to compete with him. I mean, the only hope for some Tunisians at the time, for a female leader was Abir Moussi, who's in jail now, despite having issues with her issues with the old regime, despite being very controversial. But and also when we look at the bigger image, there's a grim picture of violence against women, that has increased, since his election. The number of femicides, has increased. The violence against, female activists. For the first time, I think, in Tunisian history, we have a Black Tunisian female who's in jail now, who, short of accusing her of trying to bring her African brothers to colonize Tunisia, there now she's standing, talking about Saadi Musbih standing, been accused of money laundering. And that's it's a very smart tactic from the regime, because it doesn't want to show that it is a racist, it's a racist regime. I saw one of the questions about, in the chat about Said, embracing this supremacist ideology, to please Europeans. I think it's much more complex than that. I guess, things are, this racist rhetoric or tone inside, is translated in the wider Tunisian society. There is this anti-Black racism, but also, and sorry, probably if I veered a little bit from your question, but it all links, to this misogyny, racism, mantra of a populist, leader who uses, all the means, despite how dirty tricks they are, just to remain in power. And so, unfortunately, again, even seeing, feminist organizations, struggling, to get, to face this regime, despite, again, 2 weeks ago, the protest, that was on Habib Bourguiba, where a lot of female activists were present there, but the general atmosphere is that of fear, that nobody now dares in Tunisia, including women, to question this regime, because it has shown that it's become, an enemy to the people, basically, and because of how the West, has allowed, this, human rights abuses, to go, unpunished, and so I have to say that I remain pessimistic about that. But then the future will tell, that this is not going to be something. To be the case, in the next few years, because I do believe that Tunisian civil society organizations, especially feminist activists, will rise up against, this folly of the regime.
Thank you, Huda. And finally, Hamza, looking forward, kind of, where do you see the larger scale economic impact affecting the average Tunisian, in terms of inflation, in terms of the cost of living, given the elections, given everything that's taking place around it? What do you see basically looking forward, as much as you can, basically?
No, I think, Tunisia is facing and has been facing actually really a structural economic crisis. This is not new. Really, it started even before 2011, and I think if we go back at least to make a sort of an assessment of to understand why to some point the democratic transition failed, it's clear that it failed, because of its incapacity to transform the economy, to open up the economy, to build a free economy. Actually, this is transforming the economy was or should have gone hand in hand with the democratic transition. And my sense is that even after, the power grab of Said, he's miserably failing now because he has also failed to address the economic emergencies and giving priority to the economy. He has accumulated power. He has become a hyper president with the idea, I think, even those who supported him from the state or from within the state, from the bureaucracy, the security services, etc., from part of the political class. The idea is to give all powers, all prerogatives to a strong man who will do the reforms. But Said was not really neither willing nor able actually to do these reforms. So I think that with or without Said, before and after the 6th of October, Tunisia needs really a recovery plan, a big and structural really reform plan that needs to tackle at least three priorities, in my sense. The first one is really, building at least some security in terms of energy security and food security, because the country is spending a lot in terms of foreign currency to import energy, to import food, etc. And in today's world, this is not acceptable. And Tunisia has the potential actually to invest in renewable energies, etc. But it needs the leadership to do so. The second priority, for sure, is to help really poor Tunisians to assure and to a social safety nets, but also to reform, some subsidy regimes, all these, the SOEs, all these, old, big and long-lasting, reforms that have been waiting for years now. And for sure, the third really priority is in a way to end up this chronism in the country, the rentier position, the rentierism in Tunisia that is really undermining Tunisia's economic potential. I think the last report of the OECD, on the banking sector, gives too many good and very good insights how the big, large companies in Tunisia's economy are controlling also 7 out of 12 Tunisian banks, actually, and really stifling the space for SMEs, preventing or SMEs from growing, etc. So this is really a big challenge. I think with or without Said, this is again, I think now what we know is that Said is the wrong person in the right position. Wrong person in the sense that he has no willing, he has no capacity, he has no reform plan, he has no vision, actually. And I do think that he won't have this vision after the 6th of October. The way Said governs is really making Tunisia missing time and a lot of opportunities. What will be the outcome? Again, I think Tunisia needs to address the political situation before really tackling and addressing the economic emergencies.
Thank you for that, Hamza. So we're reaching about the last 15 minutes. And so I think as we're wrapping this up, what I'm interested in hearing from each one of you separately is, where do you kind of see everything moving forward in your specific focus area? And what does the bigger picture look like in terms of the context? You know, we could start first with Lamine, politically and legally. Where do you see this moving forward? And then this could be like your final statement, and I'll move on to each one of you separately. Lamine, you're muted, I think.
Sorry. So I'll go back to this idea that
sorry, Lamine, I'll just say one more thing. And also, because we have a lot of policy makers in our audience as well, what steps should stakeholders worldwide take as they engage with Tunisia in this critical moment?
I will try to answer both, but I will go back to the idea that things will be more complicated than expected. The effects of the 25th of July go beyond the imprisonment of a few hundred people, or the disappearance of state institution and the crumbling of the rule of law. It has much deeper consequences on Tunisia and on Tunisians in general. It has undermined the idea of collective salvation, I would say, and has reduced solutions to political problem to individual salvation. And that's why we see a surge in migration, for example. That's why we see a surge in crime rates. That's why we see a surge in drug and alcohol consumption, for example. There is no political project anymore. There's nothing that binds us as citizens anymore. And that is probably the deepest impact of fear and political apathy combined throughout these past 3 years. So the most difficult part, if we're still here, is to rebuild that trust in a collective good, and to rebuild that trust in democracy, in elections, in media, in civil society, in political parties. I think that will be the most daunting work that is left for us to do. Will civil society, political parties, or what remain of them have the space or the necessary space to do that in-depth work? That remains to be seen. But then again, maybe to finish on a slightly optimistic note, again, there are spaces of dissent and of contest, and people who are interested in public life that are left and that can be found elsewhere. You don't just wipe out 10 years of freedom and democracy like that. There are people who were born, who became mature in the context of freedom. They don't know the police state. They don't know the fear of a single man ruler. They don't know about removing the batteries of your phone when you speak. That's how we used to talk before the revolution when we talked about sensitive matters. They don't know that, and I think these are things that we should be building on as civil society, as political parties, as Tunisian individuals, and not only Tunisian individuals, as people who believe that democracy is still possible in a country like Tunisia.
Thank you, Hamza. Thank you, Lamine. So next, Hamza, I'll ask you also a very similar question. What steps should stakeholders worldwide take as they engage with Tunisia in this critical moment as it relates to the economy and your focus area?
Well, I think, yeah, it's a very critical moment. I would like to end with an optimistic note, simply because really, I'm really confident that what we are seeing today in Tunisia, despite all, I mean, all challenges, is there is still hope in a sense. I think that there is still hope. The first one, there are some, at least two important signs. The first one is it's clear to me that Said miscalculated the political capacity of the opposition, actually. He counted on the opposition to boycott, or how he anticipated the opposition to boycott. What we saw is that the opposition succeeded, despite all challenges, to collect endorsement, to participate, and to go to the administrative court, and to really to push the regime in the corner. This is extremely important. The second thing is that Said miscalculated the resistance of the justice system and of many judges, really, in the administrative court, but in other sectors, despite manipulation. And I think Amin described very well this whole instrumentalization of the judiciary, etc. But there is still resistance. There are still people resisting. There are pockets of resistance in the country, in many sectors, actually, despite this repressive, atmosphere and climate in the country. So these are really some good signs, and the result is that the street is reviving today. People are trying to build new coordination, to get closer to each other. For sure, I think that there will be debate, and there will be initiatives. Now, Tunisia, it seems like, in front of really in a critical moment and a critical situation. It could go the Senegalese path, we can think of a Senegalese scenario where you have a candidate arrested who will the elections while in jail, actually. If the opposition agree to push really behind Ayashi Zamal, if really there is a big mobilization for, we will see. Really, it's too early to say. I think that things are really moving and on a day-to-day basis. So, and even there is no clear, actually, decision taken by different and the political actors. But Tunisia can go also the way the Venezuelan scenario, which is really a president holding on to power, repressing, rejecting, the decisions of the administrative court, and repressing actually his population and the population. And here, really, the big either scenarios, or maybe a third scenario with the postponing and the collapse of this whole, rigged, electoral process. The end result of this is that Said will be a weak president, and he will end up being a burden even for the security services who supported him. And this is extremely important. For me, just to end up on a positive note, really, I think change will happen in Tunisia. The question is when. Either on the 6th of October or after the 6th of October, several months after the 6th of October, or things can accelerate. I don't know, really. No one, I think, can tell us about the future. But change is inevitable in Tunisia. Let's hope that there be a smooth change and a positive change, because there are these pockets of resistance, and there are really people who are mobilizing and who are really trying to keep this, democratic experiment alive in a way. That's important. So from the international community perspective, it's important to really insist on human rights. Really, this is extremely important. I think we know we are in an international, a moment in the international relations where, let's say, realism is extremely brutal, and I think international relations are becoming brutal, and we are seeing this in many, especially now in Gaza, in Lebanon, in many regions in the world, and especially in our region. But I think for the sake of everyone, I think Tunisia can really be a place where Tunisian people decide for themselves. But when they decide to hit to the streets and to mobilize, it's important really that they will be at least backed by people who will defend freedom, liberty, and justice in the world.
Thank you very much, Hamza. And last but definitely not least, Huda, how do you see things moving forward, and what steps should stakeholders worldwide take as they engage with Tunisia?
Well, I tend to be best optimistic, to use Emil Habib al-Mutasha'ili now, pessimist and optimist at the same time. I think in the case of civil society organizations and activists, especially when it comes to irregular migration, I think there was a break of the social contract within Tunisian population since Qais Said's power grab in 2021, and there wasn't any. I noticed at least the absence of regional organizations, especially the African Union, having a muted response to his racist speech, despite because of I guess they tried to be diplomatic in that instance, but we've seen more. Critical voice, for example, from South Africa, which wasn't very pleased, with that. In that respect, I think the fact that West African countries in particular have failed, in facing, the fate of their nationals in Tunisia, especially after the Said speech and the violent, attacks on them. Resonates with how autocrats they are able to muffle the dissidents, especially when it comes to these human rights abuses. Now on the brighter side, I have to say that the 10 years of Tunisian democratic transition, despite being very fragile, there was an overhaul in Tunisian, let's say, political culture, that a lot of them, they have been educated on the anti-Black racism, something that has been a big taboo since the abolition of slavery in 1846 in Tunisia. So for the first time, when you have a country that has adopted the first anti-racial discrimination legislation ever in the region, that was revolutionary in itself. And because a lot of the protesters that we have seen in the last couple of weeks, were kids back in 2011, they were brought up, as Lamine has said, in a democratic, let's say, space where they have never seen a single man rule. They were not educated into fearing, the wars because your neighbor is going to the police, and it's not the 1984 type of war that they were brought up in, and they are very lucky. And so when the quote-unquote pogroms have happened, against, Black African migrants in 2023, we have seen those big protests, mainly from non-Black Tunisians, who were calling the president, racist. We have seen, unfortunately, for example, someone like Rashad Tamboura, who was jailed because of a tag, calling Qais Said, racists. Recently, the same, slogan has been taken up in the protests, and it shows, that people in Tunisia, especially younger generation, are not normalized anti-Black racism anymore. And so they see in the failure of regional organizations, be it the African Union, the Arab League, and even the EU, because we see, unfortunately, that right now Europe is embracing fully the far right rhetoric, and so the change is gonna definitely come from inside, from that civil society. And I remain optimistic because, as someone who's lived in the country until 2018, about who travels, every year, I see a lot of change, in people's rhetoric, that they feel uncomfortable, with Said's, racist rhetoric. At one time, some Black African migrant people that I would meet, they feel that Tunisia has become the most racist country in the continent, and it saddens me because, as a Black person, that's something that that shows, how Tunisia has become, from a country that has been part, been part of what the African Union has become today, to a rogue state, basically. But as I said, the hope remains in that younger generation, but also in Black women activists. Despite being hounded, some of them, they had to escape the country. But they are fighting. With their little means, whether at the regional level. Yes, a lot of them, they don't have the social and political culture, capital that they have to denounce this regime. But thankfully, non-Black Tunisians, they have that privilege, to speak up, to speak for them, because this is about human rights. It's not about just a specific minority group, because it's all about how to restore democracy in Tunisia. Because 10 years of democracy is not nothing. It's something that we built, a strong social, political contract and economic contract, so that it becomes, available for the next generation to come.
Thank you so much, Huda. So we're now reached the end of our time. I want to first of all thank our amazing, brilliant speakers, Lamine, Hamza, Huda, for their insight and expertise, and thank you for making the time as well. I'd like to also thank our audience for their engagement and questions throughout the discussion, and also the rest of the TimeMap team who supported me very much in this planning of today's event. And this event is also part of TimeMap's long-standing commitment to programming around Tunisia, which, as many of you may know, is the one of the Institute's priority countries. So please visit our website and follow along on social media. On Twitter, we're at TimeMapDC. On Instagram, we're Tahrir Institute. And please keep up to date. We're still going to be following the elections. They're taking place in a couple more weeks. And we have produced and will continue to produce a lot of work around key issues on the country for the rule of law and the economy. And, as a final note, I just want to say on behalf of TimeMap, I'd like to thank you all for joining, and thank you all again to the speakers. Have a great rest of your day.